Today at the National Press Club, Arunda and Kalkadoon filmmaker Rachel Perkins and historian Professor Henry Reynolds. Together they've worked on the new series, The Australian Wars, charting the bloody battles fought during the British colonisation of what became Australia. Rachel Perkins and Professor Henry Reynolds with today's National Press Club address.
I want to talk today about our series, The Australian Wars. It's still screening on SBS. And the response to it. Recently, the Australian War Memorial, during the period that the series was being broadcast, in a very low-key way, announced that they would have a wider and more in-depth acknowledgement of frontier conflict. And I must say that I wept when I heard that. And I felt moved because what was signalled as a great shift in the Australian nation by this institution, I didn't think I might see that in my lifetime, because people like Henry and others have pushed so long for this change and so long for this recognition, and I wasn't sure that I would see it come. And I think we are on the cusp of great change in this country, not just within our institutions, but in our population. We know that 89% of Australians today support a formal truth-telling process, 89%. It shows me that Australians are ready to come to terms with their history, and the overwhelming response that I've had personally to the series in letters, phone calls, emails, people from all walks of life saying how moved they were and how they were not taught this in school. Some people knew part of it, but they didn't know the whole story. And so for many Australians, this content, this history is a revelation to them. But we also know that 62% of Australians accept that frontier violence occurred as part of our national history. But of course, after the announcement from the War Memorial, there's always the predictable backlash. And although my mother, who's here in the audience, has taught me to be gracious, at this moment I would like to respond to some of that criticism. So it's been a race to the bottom for people like Andrew Bolt. And he has described the suggestion of the recognition of frontier violence by the Australian War Memorial in the following terms. He's described it as disgusting. He's likened the behaviour of the Australian War Memorial to prostitution. There's been other campaigns where people have said, hands off our war memorial. Well, hands off our war memorial. Well, whose war memorial exactly is it if it is not a war memorial of the Australian people? But for people like this, that definition of ours does not include, clearly, the dead in my family. What they are saying to us is that the names and the stories of our dead should be taken somewhere else. The more polite say that they should be commemorated at the Australian Museum. And when I hear that, I think, oh yes, commemorate our dead along the stuffed crocodiles and the vintage cars and the curios of our deep past. Or they say our dead should be commemorated at the new IATSIS building, Ngura, which is to be built. There they are saying, well, it should just be put all, over with all the other blackfella stuff, at Ngura. Shouldn't be in our institution. Well, if you put it at Ngura alone, what about all those non-Indigenous Australians who lost their lives, the men, women and children? Are they to be put over there as well in the museum or at Ngura? Inherent in this argument is that somehow this part of our history is fundamentally not Australian, and more offensively, that Aboriginal people, the first people of this land, who did die defending their country and their people, are not Australians. Andrew Hastie, Opposition Defence spokesperson, said, "The purpose of the War Memorial is to commemorate Australia's fallen, those who have those who have died defending our country. We've got to be careful about the purpose of these national institutions. Ngurra is going to tell the Indigenous Australian story, and the War Memorial commemorates, again, our war dead.
The controversy became central to the culture wars after the accession of John Howard in 1996. Now, there's no doubt that John Howard was personally extremely antagonistic to what he called the black arm view of history. And his antagonism was generally, was widespread amongst conservative Australians, and eventually Keith Windschuttle, in a series of articles and then in a book, mounted a frontal attack on the sort of history that I'd been writing, and let me say, many others as well. It was, as I say, it was a powerful polemic which many people welcomed, because it appeared to say all this talk about conflict and warfare is a lot of nonsense, it's politically inspired, it's by people, as he said to me in one of the debates, I was a person, he hated people like me who hated their own country. That was the motivation that he thought inspired the people who had written this history. Now, the interesting thing is that despite the quite significant popular reception to Windschuttle, what it did was to inspire a totally new era of research, of old hands like Lyndall Ryan and me, who went back to our notes, and then a whole new generation of students who redid the history, particularly in Tasmania, Queensland and Western Australia. And they made it quite clear, indeed, if it needed repeating, that the violence was ubiquitous and the death toll was much higher than we had supposed. I had suggested in 1981, on the other side of the frontier, that it was reasonable to suppose that 20,000 people had died in frontier wars. As it turned out, that was very much less than what the likely total is now. Extremely important work in Queensland is suggesting that the death toll in Queensland alone may have been 60,000. If that is true, and the research is compelling, then the death toll overall in the frontier wars approaches perhaps 100,000. Very much the same number of people who died in overseas wars. Now, what I think the post-Windschuttle research, if I may call it that, the post-Windschuttle research put these questions beyond reasonable doubt. The conflict was everywhere and it had a very, very high death rate. Now this, I think, is in so many ways the strength of Rachel's series, The Australian Wars. That is over and above her brilliance as a filmmaker. But the filmmaking was based on a massive amount of research. That is, the people working with Rachel had brought together much of the new research, including also much of the old research. So what you saw was a distillation, and a brilliant distillation, of the situation of Australian historiography up to the moment. And in a way, that is why it'll be so important, because it will reach such a wide audience, a much wider audience than we who write books, let alone those who write articles in serious academic journals, or let alone academic theses. So what then do we say about the material that is presented? Well, clearly, there's no doubt that we're talking about war. And after all, the military historians had been saying that for 20 years. It was a war, and in many ways, as we say in the film, Australia's most important war. Important because it lasted for 140 years, it was fought everywhere, and above all, it answers the question of what was the war about. Now, up until recently, and still there are people who say, yes, of course there was conflict. But after all, it was petty, small-scale conflict about things like theft and trespass, personal revenge, and unseemly and squalid arguments about women. Therefore, it lacks the grandeur and gravity of war. And that is still commonly expressed. But that argument can no longer stand up following the Mabo case in 1992. Because remember, in the one sentence of enormous gravity was Brennan saying, the Miriam people are entitled, as against the whole world, to possession, occupation, use and enjoyment of the island of Mer. Now that applied to the whole of Australia. Every one of the small nations, from Murray in the far northeast to southern Tasmania, to the coast of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, these small nations were in possession and occupation of their country, which they used and enjoyed, and this was true of the whole continent. So the war after 1992 had to be about the possession and control of land over a whole continent. Now, how can that not be a war of global significance? What other war in recent times has seen such a transfer of land over such a vast area?
You mentioned some of the blowback from the series. What's your sense of the state of the culture wars now, post the change of government? I mean, they're obviously still alive, but do you feel that there's been some sort of tilt away from the sort of thing that you're talking about that started in '96?
Well, I think so. But when the head of the RSL rejects the proposal to have inclusion of frontier conflict in an expanded form at the War Memorial, I'm reminded of, you know, the RSL's long tradition of banning Aboriginal people from their RSLs around the country, and, you know, we remember those things. You know, we forgive but not forget. And I think the country is going through a change, but it's a long time coming. You know, it's far too slow for me and many other people. But I do have great hope in the education system. We've created a number of teachers' guides to the series. We recently had a webinar, 200 teachers registered to learn about how they could facilitate this education, this curriculum material in their classes. I think the problem is that a lot of teachers who are my generation didn't grow up learning this history, weren't taught it at school, feel inadequate about it, don't know a lot about it, don't feel necessarily comfortable as a non-Indigenous Australian teaching this history. And what we've said to people is that this is a shared history. You know, very deliberately, this is our history. This is not something for Indigenous people to carry alone. It's the story of the formation of our nation, and you just have to look at it, you know, as the truth that it is, and come to terms with it like they have in other, you know, comparable nations, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Canada, Germany. You know, it's the sign of a mature nation, and it starts with education, and I think we will see a big change in the future. I just don't think we can go on hiding from this history any longer.
Hi. One of the things that I was sort of struck by watching the documentary is that while this is a very tragic history, there are also some stories of heroes that are kind of emerging. And there are probably a lot of heroes who we don't know about. And that's been one of the sad things about this we've been kind of deprived of from the silence. Just curious as to what both of you think about that, about some of those stories of resistance and heroes that are missing in the history.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, the history book is the history books have drawn these people out of the records. Henry and Nick Clements's recent book Tonga Longata, is a fantastic example, and there are many others. Books on Truganini, books on Dundalli in Queensland, Windradyne in New South Wales, Pemulwuy, of course, well known. So many heroic individuals who did resist the incursion into their country. And I think it's, we have this mythology that the Maoris fought in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Aboriginal men and women just laid down and accepted it, or just, slowly melted away. And, that's something that I think we can be very proud of, the resilience of these people, particularly someone like Tonga Longata, who fought down to like the last 26 people, against the whole male population of Tasmania, white population. That is incredibly heroic. So yes, we can be rightly proud of them. And yes, by denying the history, we deny all Australians' right to be proud of these historical figures.
Yes, I mean, I agree entirely. There are so many. And the point is that we think about the war against the Aborigines or the First Nations, but it was war against all the the mosaic of small independent nations. And so each of them has a somewhat different story to tell. So there's a incredibly complex, detailed story yet to be told. That is how and when the war was fought in each of those national groups. And all of them will have a different story. Some of them, indeed, there'll be the fighting, the resistance, but then there's also the way in which they came to agreements, if you like, the peace treaties, worked out, because there was nothing done at the top or legally, it had to be done locally. And so there's a tremendously complex, interesting story to be told, and part of that is indeed the extraordinary resistance against impossible odds. I mean, the problem in Tasmania, they were so good at it, but they didn't realise that behind the few white men they came across was a vast reservoir of humanity that kept arriving. So no matter if they killed 200 could arrive on the next convict ship. So.
Well, we've already seen backlash to the proposal that we should change our democratic system to recognise Indigenous people within it. That's been highly resisted from a number of senior ex-Prime Ministers and senior Australians, and no doubt that will gain momentum. But many modern democracies that have First People and indeed had conflict have resolved these issues in their constitution. Aotearoa and New Zealand being one of them. I think that the referendum can only be a positive unifying process for the nation, because it will enable us to come to terms with this history and will give Indigenous people a voice to Parliament, a voice in the democratic process, because of the special nature of being First Nations. And that can only help with the healing. And there's a reason, though, that the voice to Parliament comes first, with the Makarrata Commission second, and truth-telling third. Because we don't want a process of truth-telling without any structural change and reform. We don't want a process where people hear the truth and then do nothing with it. So it's a very deliberate, scheduling of the work in front of this nation to resolve these issues. But yes, we will hear far more negative responses as we had with the equal marriage debate, and my hope is that the fairness and justness of Australians, as it did with equal marriage, that will rise to the top, and we will see this change in our country, and then we will be able to move on in a unified way together. That is my absolute aspiration and hope for the nation. And having worked with this history for many less years than Henry does, and have this history in my own family, you know, I feel like we do need to move forward and deal with this history, and giving people a voice in our modern democracy is the first way to do it. So I have great hope, and I commit myself to pursuing that, you know, and supporting Linda Burney and others in progressing that agenda. Henry?
Nick Stewart.
Very much.
Thank you, Laura. Nick Stewart from the Canberra Times. You've well and truly shattered the great Australian silence, and now even the modern military is, for example, incorporating First Nations traditions in their welcomes to country, using didgeridoos as an important part of military ceremonies. Do you think that what you've done by opening the door, by pardon me, shining a spotlight on this tradition, is actually enabling people to come to terms with the past in a way that we couldn't previously, that it's actually opened a door to a new way of dealing, that the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as a martial race has, if you like, made it easier for some of the military people to actually accept the fact that there was a war?
Yes, an interesting question. I think there's got to be the acceptance that what was happening in Australia was happening all over the British Empire. There were wars everywhere in the period of Australian colonisation, so the 19th century mainly, saw Britain fighting wars almost everywhere in the world, but they were small wars, and there's a whole sort of there's a whole area of military history and military study about small wars. That is, they are not like wars the Europeans fought, because they were against people who weren't organised, you know, but there's a vast array of the different ways in which the subjects of British imperialism fought back. Now, I think it is also important not just to see that true in Australia, but to see the Australian struggle as part of the struggle of non-European people against the empire. And that raises its significance, I think, even higher. And I mean, the war was, you know, the war in Australia was quintessentially Australian, because it had to be fought little bit by little bit, because you're dealing with a mosaic of small independent nations. You couldn't just hit one lot and say, they'll now learn. You had to continue for that to happen. And it also allows you to look at to look at the tactics and the strategy used by the First Nations in their attempt to counter the greater power and mobility of the Europeans. So it does have to be cast in that much larger scale of military history, and there's every reason to do that. But your comments, I think, therefore, are very, very interesting indeed.
No, okay.
Well, I'll start. The first thing we've got to do is to recognise that for a long, long time we have not been British. I see no reason why we feel we should identify with the British imperialism at all. And that makes it far easier then to see the First Nations as the true patriots. That's enough.
That's a pretty good finish. I don't know whether I should add anything after that. Look, there's people who know more about this than I do, who've studied war and healing processes and indeed truth-telling processes and treaty-making processes. I look for inspiration to Aotearoa and New Zealand for what they've done, and look at the treaty settlement process as an example of ways in which Māori are able to emotionally express their history and what's occurred within their iwi in relation to the Crown. And as I understand it, in the treaty settlement process, there is a history that is prepared of the relationship between the iwi and the Crown, and in some cases, indeed, the monarch has apologised, a formal apology to the iwi, I think in the first settlement that happened under the Waitangi Tribunal. So I think there are, let's say, case studies we can look to in Australia for how this formal process must be done. But it must be formalised, I think. It must have a structural reform outcome. There must be some reparations as part of the process, and there must be the opportunity for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people who are part of this together to express themselves in an emotional way in what's happened to their families and the trauma that they carry today because of that legacy of history. And it must be a formal structural process. It's not walking over a bridge, as important as that was. It's not holding hands around Parliament House. It is structural reform, nation by nation, to look at what occurred and redress that history today. Because otherwise, Aboriginal people will be carrying this legacy, and Torres Strait Islanders, of what's happened to them into the future. So I think over the next decade, we'll see that process roll out across the country. We're seeing it in Victoria, who are leading the way. We'll see it at a federal level, and it's well overdue.
Thank you.
Just that point about what's happening in New Zealand and this, wrapping up the point Misha is making about psychology and leadership. The Jim Bolger, who was the Conservative Prime Minister who actually ended up putting the Waitangi Tribunal into place, was asked why he did it, and he said because it was a matter of honour. It was a matter of honour of our country. And I remember reading that and thinking that that's not language that we've heard in Australia for a very long time. No. So it'd be a good thing to hear. Please join me in thanking our guests for speaking to us. Thank you very much.